Welcome everyone to the April meeting of the Environmental Quality Board, or EQB. I'm Nancy Daubenberger, and I'm the Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Transportation and the Chair of the EQB. And sorry, I'm not there in person today. I'm at the Senate building, and I will need to jump off just before 3 o'clock for a 3 o'clock hearing on a transportation bill. So with that, why don't we go ahead and call the roll? And I will note that Commissioner Stroman has graciously agreed to jump in for me as chair if we haven't wrapped the meeting up by that point. So thank you, Commissioner Stroman. So Executive Director Nuschler, would you please go ahead and do the roll call?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Commissioner Arnold. Okay. Board Member Bakken. Board Member Bauerkemper.
I'm here, thanks.
And Board Member Cunningham is not with us, but Myra is with us today. Mayor Daubenberger.
Here.
Commissioner Gronball. Board Member Hintz.
Here.
And Board Member Katzenberger. Commissioner Kessler. Board Member Martin. Don't think we're expecting. Commissioner Verlek. We have Deputy Commissioner McKinnon. Board Member Nelson.
Present.
Commissioner Peterson.
Here.
Commissioner Stroman. Here. Chair Holman.
Present.
Member Zelli is not with us, but we have Sue Bento. In a circle back, Board Member Bakken. Board Member Bakken, I thought we saw you.
There we go. Now I'm unmuted. I'm here.
Excellent.
Present. Thank you.
Fabulous. Commissioner Gronball. Going back to people.
And Executive Director Nuschler, I think I saw a note that Commissioner Gronvall might be joining late, like around 2 o'clock.
Oh, great. Thank you, Chair. And I do believe we're expecting Commissioner Kessler in a few minutes, but with that, Madam Chair, at this point, we do have 9 members, so I believe that is a quorum.
Great. Well, we'll move on in the agenda then, and that will be to the approval of the consent agenda. So that is the meeting minutes from the February 21st meeting of EQB, located on your packet page 5, and also the preliminary agenda for the April 17th meeting, today's meeting, and that's on packet page 3. So is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I'll move the consent agenda. Commissioner Peters.
Thank you, Commissioner Peterson. Do I have a second?
Second. Member Katzenberger.
Thank you. Board Member Katzenberg. May I have, let's see, I'm sorry, any discussion on the motion? Not hearing any. All in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed, say nay. Hearing no opposition, the motion carries and consent agenda is adopted. So now I will turn it over to Executive Director Nuschler for her ED report. Go ahead, Executive Director Nuschler.
All right. Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all of you who are joining us today. It's really nice to be in a room and in a space with all of you. I'd say I wish we had windows, but at least last I checked, it was gray outside, so it doesn't matter that we're in the basement. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. Logistics, we are in a hybrid space. This meeting is being recorded, as it should say on your screen. For those of you online, the meeting chat is open and visible to everyone, but we do not keep it as part of the meeting record, so please only use it for logistical issues. Board members, we welcome your questions and feedback, and again, noted, we have a new piece of technology that will point to you as you're talking, so hopefully make it easier for those of you in the room or those online to see those in the room when they're asking questions. Board members, if you're online, feel free to use the raise hand or jump in during this discussions. You should be able to mute and unmute yourself. And it is, of course, helpful to have your camera on. If you're here in person, I was gonna say signal the chair, but she's online, which will make that a little difficult. I'm sure we can manage the flow of discussion in the room. For members of the public, there's going to be 2 opportunities for comment and input today. The first will be prior to or during the discussion and prior to any vote on the tribal coordination and consultation policy, and that time will be specific to that item. And then the second time will be a general comment period at the end of the meeting, which we will focus on comments or input related to our item on nitrate and the water plan. If you're here in person and you want to speak, please use the sign-up sheets to indicate that you want to make a comment. If you're online, when we get to that part of the agenda, use the raised hand button at the top of Teams, and we will add your name. We'll queue commenters at the relevant point in the agenda and likely go back and forth between in-person and online commenters. And if you need a reminder, the procedures are on the slide. They're also in the packet. If you are online, when we notify you, you can speak. You might have a little bit of a lag before you can unmute, but it will work. Just take a minute. I think that's it for that. We will, depending on, we will try to stick pretty tightly to our agenda times for the first 2 items in particular to make sure we have plenty of time for the last item and may limit comments accordingly. So that's the kind of the logistics. I'm going to keep my report fairly short, starting with appointments, board appointments. At the ARIS meeting last month, if you were all watching, board member Ken Foster did announce his resignation from the board as he's moving away from Minnesota. We're sad to see him go. We are actively recruiting for a new public member in CD7. More information about that is on our website. So if you know anyone out in CD7 who would be a good addition to our board, please share the information or let us know and we will reach out to them. No other updates on appointments at this time. Legislative session, as we were just talking about before the meeting started, all the omnibus bills that are compiling all the ideas are getting put together and we're seeing a lot of them this week. So there's, I think now about 3 bills, omnibus bills that might have something related to EQB in them that we're tracking. Most of those are things that would require changes to the environmental review rules. But I don't have a lot of information since last month, and I don't have a legislative crystal ball, which would be really handy to all of us if I did. So we will see what happens next month. In general, we're continuing to move forward with a lot of our projects, including kicking off the team of technical advisors that are going to help with the climate calculator, working on the mandatory categories report and various other things that you will hear about in the upcoming months. And in the interest of time, I think I'm going to stop there and let us take questions or let us get on to our agenda.
Thank you, Edie Nuschler. Right, with that, are there any questions for Catherine with the Executive Director's report? I'm not hearing any questions. So with that, we can move on in the agenda and just to check here, Edie Nuschler or others, did you see we have President Larson trying to get into the meeting?
Yes, Chair, I think we've got that, and I'm sure we're working on it.
Thank you. Okay. All right. Make sure that get him in here for the next agenda item, which is the tribal coordination and consultation policy. And with that, we have Kayla Walsh, our environmental review program administrator and point of contact for tribal relations for EQB. And she'll present the draft tribal policy to us. That is on page 17 of your packet. So welcome, Kayla.
Great. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, members of the board and members of the public who are here today. This draft EQB tribal policy that I will be talking through today, again, you've also received a separate draft of it, which is updated slightly. And so that's a separate packet item for those of you in the room. That's a separate sheets that are stapled together. And the updates also found on our website online. And so this tribal coordination consultation policy basically outlines EQB's commitments to how we seek to work with tribes. Tribal coordination and consultation policies are required for some agencies under the statute, Minnesota Statute 1065. And the state of Minnesota is home to 11 federally recognized Indian tribes, all with their own tribal governments and government officials. Each tribe is a separate sovereign nation, unique to itself and distinct from all other federally recognized tribes. And each tribe has an independent relationship with the federal government and with the state of Minnesota. And the statute acknowledges and supports the unique status of Minnesota tribes and their absolute right to existence, self-governance, and self-determination. It says that the state of Minnesota and the Minnesota tribal government significantly benefit from working together, learning from one another, and partnering wherever possible. And 1065 asks certain agencies to create consultation policies and name tribal liaisons to do this work and commit to consultation with each tribe at least annually. So that's what 1065 outlines.
Kayla, could you make sure you're speaking up a little bit?
I know, I'm wondering, I've moved slightly closer to the mic. I did see that message come through. So let's see if this is helpful. Great.
Thank you, Kayla.
Yes. Okay, so with that background, it's important to note that some agencies that do serve on our board here implement their own tribal consultation policies. And EQB as a board is not named in this legislation, but it is highly encouraged that boards and other government entities voluntarily create their own policies. And so that's why, we added a line in the draft policy that specifically says, this policy is prepared in accordance with Minnesota statutes and rules, federal statutes and regulations. It does not apply to board member agencies acting within the scope of their own authorities and their own consultation policies. The EQB coordination and consultation will be specific to the scope of EQB's authority. So an example of that might include coordination and consultation that is specific to EQB's authorities for the state water plan or environmental review rulemaking, for instance, or even the pollinator report. So anything that EQB is legislatively directed to do as a board. But if an agency is acting as a responsible governmental unit and there's a need to consult directly on a decision that they're making as a responsible governmental unit, that would be covered by that individual agency's policy. So as we were crafting this, I did meet with liaisons from the state agencies of our board and did borrow language from existing policies. So we're not recreating the wheel with this language, and we did tailor it to meet EQB's unique work. And the definitions in the policy are directly from 1065 as well. All right, so 1065 does not directly charge EQB, again, with implementing a tribal coordination and consultation policy, or even with designating a tribal liaison, but it does encourage and allow for agencies and boards to engage in consultation and communication with Minnesota tribal governments for all matters that have tribal implication. And so having this policy really just commits EQB to sharing information early and often and holds us accountable to offering consultations yearly. And it does not hold tribes to anything. It really only commits EQB to institutionalize some of these practices for early and often communication. So in the draft, we say the purpose of this policy is to develop, maintain, and improve meaningful government-to-government relationships and to ensure effective communication and coordination on anything that may affect one or more tribal nations that share geography with the state of Minnesota. So EQB, this policy commits us to regularly sharing information, promoting open dialogue, and recognizing and reacting to tribal concerns in all facets of our work. Steps to coordination are laid out in the document. So we will identify issues that may impact tribes and that might require coordination on a staff-to-staff level. So that involves reaching out to the appropriate tribal staff with information and sharing that with sufficient time for them to consider the information and provide meaningful input. And EQB will accept any form of input, and then it might take multiple iterations of coordination to respond to tribal needs. And then EQB will also provide documentation of the coordination and communicate how it informed decision making. So that includes an explanation for why that might not be used due to limited authority or for whatever reason. Important to follow up. And then at any point in that process, EQB or tribes could request that consultation occurs. And so that moves the conversation from staff level to a government leadership level. And the general process is the same with identifying problems, notifying, information sharing, and using input from tribes. So that all remains the same, but it's happening at a government level. So to sum that all up, EQB really commits to offering to meet at least annually with tribal nations in their leadership to identify priority issues for coordination or consultation on matters that have tribal implication. And for some more background on the process, this draft has been in the works for about a year now. We have put a lot of thought into the phrasing of the document. We have shared it with agency liaisons, with tribal environmental committees, MnTech, and with tribal leadership. And we've taken in a lot of feedback and improved the document, and we want to keep doing that. Even if it's approved, we want to make sure that we continue learning and growing from our experiences, and want to leave this open to making adjustments to the policy as needed and as we learn from implementing it. And so we feel like this really is laying the groundwork for putting in the time for working meaningfully with tribes. And for example, through the continuous improvement process we did in 2023, tribes identified many ways, and even talking with the Minnesota Tribal Environmental Council, identified a lot of ways that the environmental review program could evolve. And we want to institutionalize a good way of working with tribes regularly to make such modernizations and updates to our program. And this is a good way to start institutionalizing that and holding ourselves accountable to being very mindful in our work with tribes. So I think this policy is really about trust, transparency, and accountability, and establishing appropriate expectations for how we can be held accountable as EQB. So with that, I would be happy to take any questions or allow the board time to discuss. So thank you.
Thank you, Kayla, for explaining the policy and talking through the outreach you did as part of developing the policy. There's been a lot of work on your part and your team, and I really appreciate that. And those who've weighed in, including, I know some of the tribal liaisons at the agencies have weighed in on this too. And with that, why don't we go to questions from board members?
I don't know, you can't see me. But, Member Katzenberger's raising his hand.
Go ahead, Member Katzenberger.
Just a quick question I have. So this is slightly changed from what was provided to us last week for review. I saw one of the changes was a signature page, and it got enveloped into the actual document, it looks like. Are there other changes that happened that are material or just minor spelling?
That's a great question. The only substantial change that happened between those two versions was the first one in the packet. It said 1065. That statute recognizes the sovereignty of tribal nations, and we changed that to say that EQB in alignment with that statute recognizes the sovereignty, so that EQB is directly stating that that's what we believe, not just that's what the statute says. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Gaylor. Are there any other questions or comments by board members?
Madam Chair, Sue Vento.
Go ahead,
I'd
Sue.
just like to make a pitch, if I could, for the tribal relations training. I had an opportunity to go through that training during the COVID experience, which took the joy out of being able to be at a week-long in-person training. And it was instead spread out over several months, but it was one of the greatest courses I've taken in almost 70 years. So I just can't say enough good about it. It was excellent. And our colleague, Dr. Bauerkamper and Tad Johnson did a terrific job as the lead faculty. So thank you. And I really encourage EQB staff, when you have the opportunity, to please do this training. It'll change your life.
Thank you for that. And that, if I may, Madam Chair, just reminds me to let folks know that we haven't worked with the tribal state relations training in the past to have public board members be able to participate in that as well, not just the state staff. And so I am mindful, and I think actually most of the staff have been through it at this point. But also if you're a board member and you didn't get to go last year, I think many of you did, please let me know, and we'd be happy to work on trying to get you into that training.
Thank you, ED Nuschler, and thanks for those comments, Sue. And let's go to board member Bauerkamper.
Thank you, Chair. Of course, thank you, Sue, for those affirmations of that program. Certainly look forward to seeing many folks there. A couple questions for Kayla. Kayla, thank you for your work on this. First question is if you can elaborate a little bit more about work that you did and that you coordinated with others to do to engage tribal input into the drafting of this policy, and if you feel that was effective. Can you tell us a little bit more about that process?
Yeah, thank you, Member Bauerkamper, for the question. So when we first started talking about having a draft policy, we first checked in with the liaisons and I had held a meeting with the liaisons to discuss their experience in drafting their own policies. And that's a big difference between the EQB and the state agencies that are named in 1065, is we don't have a tribal liaison working on behalf of EQB. We're calling my position a point of contact for tribes. And so I'm attending the Minnesota Tribal Environmental Council meetings and presenting regularly there and updating on our work. But I think that that's just something that, has come up for me in doing this work and trying to do it very meaningfully and engaging with folks on a regular basis. So I've attended MinTech meetings, worked with liaisons, and we have reached out to tribes, and we have a tribal notification list that we keep on our environmental review website. So those that are working in environmental review or environmental staff with tribes. And I do think that we've received some good feedback. We've made some updates based on that feedback. And I think there's room to do more. There's always room to do more and to have more one-on-one conversations with individual tribes. That's something that I think we could continue doing, whether we adopt this policy or not. And we can always learn and grow from those one-on-one conversations. But I hope this policy will also afford us to have more meaningful conversations in that way. And I don't know if Executive Director Nuschler, if you have anything else to add.
I think, Kayla, you covered it. I think we really tried to share out information and to offer a lot of opportunities to discuss. And while I think in general, we got feedback that it was a good thing for us to have a policy and to do one, I don't think we got very specific feedback around the language itself. And so as Kayla said, we could always use more. But we did want to bring it forward as sort of we do want to get it out there as putting forward our intent and commitment to share information in the way described.
Thank you. I appreciate those responses and the work that y'all are doing. I don't presume to know what the appetite might be among Native Nation leadership, but I would suggest that, Kayla's point of contact and Executive Director Nuschler, you might inquire about making visits with each of the tribal governing councils and see if they would be inclined to let you on their meeting agendas to touch base about the EQB and this policy and EQB activities in general, and perhaps also do that with environmental staff at each of the Native Nations. So again, something that I would encourage you all to reach out and find out if there's an appetite for that. We may hear a little bit about that in the public comment here and in the commentary that is potentially going to be offered from leadership today. Another question that I have, if I may, Chair, is to ask Kayla or Executive Director Nuschler if there are upcoming EQB initiatives, projects, things that are on the horizon that you feel might be particularly resonant with this coordination and consultation policy that might make substantive use of it in the nearer interim term.
Sure. I think there's probably a few. Certainly, the mandatory categories report as we work on that and talk about which categories may need review or change, I think would be a space to have that kind of coordination, depending on the outcome of the legislature and how we choose to consider rules and rulemaking. And if we get told to do rules, that rules is always a great place for coordination and consultation.
Yeah, I would concur that looking really closely from our continuous improvement work and environmental review and mandatory category report, there has been a lot of ideas that we need to prioritize and work plan there in fitting that around. How do we work with tribes consistently in order to have these meaningful conversations? And I think institutionalizing that in our work, having this method for doing that and holding ourselves accountable to that will hopefully help us do that now in long term into the future.
And I might just add, we do have gotten some specific suggestions from some of our tribal partners about things we should do, like make some additions to the EAW form, and those are things as we're crafting next fiscal year's work plan and figuring out like which ones of those we can take on. We can be more clear about where we can do coordination, which of those things on our work plan we believe have tribal implications and do coordination on.
Thanks.
Thank you, Board Member Bauerkemper. Are there other questions or comments
Right.
from
Commissioner
board
Daubenberger,
members?
this is Katrina.
Go
I'm
ahead.
just gonna lift up what
Commissioner
Board Member Bauerkemper said and just relay that the MPCA has invited Executive Director Nuschler to come on some of our consultations as an agency when we know that environmental review and work of the EQB is of interest, and we would be happy to do that. I mean, I will just say that because of the awesome statute we have, tribal governments are bombarded with requests for consultation, and sometimes efficiencies can be found if you go together, and we would be happy to do that. And just also say, I think it's great that the EQB is putting forth a policy, and just kind of also echo what Kayla's saying, that it can be a living document. Our policy has been evolving over the course of 4 years, and every time we have consultation, we talk about it. And you just need to have a place to start. So I think you put your best foot forward, and then you continue to learn happy to help support EQB along that.
Thank you, Commissioner Kessler. And that's a great offer. And I would also echo that offer from MnDOT to be happy to have EQB come along with the consultation. Any other questions or comments from board members? Okay, one thing
You
I
need a
wanted to
motion
mention.
then to, or sorry, do you need a motion then to adopt that or?
No, not yet.
Okay.
We did have in the packet the resolution, but thinking through some of the same thoughts that board member Bauer Kemper raised about tribal leadership weighing in, and Kayla, I know you had reached out to tribes, but it occurred to me earlier today that perhaps the MIAC board might want an opportunity to have this on their executive board agenda. I reached out to the MIAC executive director, Shannon Geshik, this morning just to offer bringing this to an upcoming MIAC meeting. And I'd like to do that before we adopt a resolution to adopt this policy, just to be able to, if they're interested in having it on a board member as a board agenda as a topic, then we could use that opportunity to explain what has been done so far, how we have developed this to this point, and whether or not they have any other suggestions for us, especially within outreach among their tribes. So with that, I want to table the motion, or the motion to adopt a resolution to adopt this policy at this point. And I am seeing some comments in the chat, and I know we're going to go to public comment too, but I'm just going to take a look. I could appreciate the EQB joining for updates and questions. Perfect. Thank you, President Larson, MIAC Chairman. I will continue to coordinate on getting that on an upcoming MIAC agenda. So thank you for that. So yeah, we will not be taking up a motion for adopting the resolution today, so it's still in draft form. But with that, we do want to take public comments, because those public comments are, of course, important to all of us and might be of interest to the MIAC board as we go out to have further conversations with them. So at this time, why don't we go ahead and move to public comment. We'll go to the sign up sheet first. And so do we have anyone signed up to make public comment on this portion of the agenda?
Do not have anyone in the room, Madam Chair,
All right,
signed up.
thank you. And so let's see, we'll see if there's anyone online who would like to make public comment.
And again, if you are online and would like to comment, please use the raised hand feature at the top of your screen in Teams, and then we will open your mic so you can speak. Or you could choose to indicate in the chat that you'd like to comment, and we can work that way as well.
If there aren't any, Madam,
Ursula?
oh, sorry. Well,
ahead.
are there any comments or?
I am not seeing any hands.
I'm
If
seeing
they're
any
not, then
hands either.
I'd make a motion then to table item number 4.
Yeah, I can second that. This is Katrina.
Thank you. So we have a motion by Commissioner Peterson to table the resolution, second by Commissioner Kessler. Let's see, any discussion on that motion? Not. hearing anything, all in favor of tabling the resolution, say aye.
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 Opposed, nay. All right. We'll table that resolution for the next time, and I will update the EQB staff on the ability to get on a future MIAC agenda. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation today, Kayla. And again, appreciate your work on it thus far. So then the next item on the agenda is the draft strategic plan and engagement. And we will have Executive Director Nuschler present that draft strategic plan engagement. And that's on page 22 of your packet. So go ahead, Executive Director Nuschler.
All right. Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, everybody. I am just going to do a brief discussion of the draft strategic plan that is in your packet with what was put together based on all of our conversations over the last few months. So what I'm really hoping for today, there's not an official vote because we're not approving this yet, but sort of would like to get the sense of the board that this is in a space where we could go out and seek some public input. I think in the past few months, we've seen a lot of others, commissions and councils, so PUC, the Clean Water Council, go out and get some public feedback on their new strategic plans, which has been, I think, very helpful to them, and they've gotten some good comments. And I would like to do the same, so I'm going to run through this, and you all can kind of let me know how it feels, and we can discuss it here today. So, the mission statement has remained relatively consistent through this process. Here on the slide, I did change the language based on our previous discussion to have the mission statement be to support informed decision-making that protects and enhances Minnesota's environmental quality, so that it would be broader and focus more on the needed decisions than I think the questions that came up in our discussion about who the people were that were going to be making the decisions. So we just adapted that language a little bit, and then have kind of the follow-on language that talks about our kind of leads into our goals. The vision has not changed. This is our current general vision about Minnesota having healthy and sustainable environmental quality that equitably supports public health, economic vitality, societal quality of life, and sustained natural resources. Based on our discussion, I did retain the values, and in the strategic plan talk about these being core things that we want to incorporate and do and keep in everything that we do, so that we want to work with collaboration, engagement, trust, and equity. Then we have, based on the discussion, and very similar to what was in kind of the framing for the discussion we had on outcomes, we have 4 key outcomes. The EQB fosters meaningful conversations around environmental issues. I did tweak the second outcome to include some language about program development. So it now says the EQB supports innovative state policy and program development on priority and emerging environmental issues. This was based on the discussion we had at the board 2 months ago, and I think some good points that Commissioner Arnold brought up. And I think it appropriately ensures that we're conveying that EQB might not always be the group that is actually deciding the big picture goals or policy for the whole state, but that we have a key role in supporting the development of the state programs that are working towards whatever that larger policy goal may be. Then we've kept the final 2 about maintaining and improving environmental review. And then the last one that we talked about achieving environmental quality without disproportionate impacts, which is probably the trickiest one in here. We'll talk more about in a moment. So our last conversation was really about the strategies. What are the things that we are going to do to move towards the goals that we have set for ourselves? And for the sake of, I don't know, nice numeracy or alignment, there's 4. So there's 4 strategies for each one of the 4 outcomes. For the outcome on meaningful conversations, we have build and maintain meaningful relationships with diverse groups representing partners and interested and affected people statewide. to regularly convene events such as the Environmental Congress that bring Minnesotans together to talk about environmental issues, to create opportunities for partners and interested and affected people to bring forward key environmental issues for discussion, and to implement policies and processes to improve engagement with tribal nations and their members. And these 4 strategies were really built from us talking about engaging the public in a variety of venues and in ways that are inclusive, in showing up where community groups are going to be, finding community connectors, and how we talked about hoping that these relationships and these conversations will result in a more diverse board, the board hearing more perspectives on various issues, and us being able to show how diverse voices were incorporated into our thinking on various issues. For the second outcome on policy and program development, again, 4 strategies. Convene the interagency pollinator protection team to ensure interagency coordination, develop cross-agency policies and programs, and report on progress towards protecting Minnesota's pollinator species. To advance water planning and policy development by supporting integrated cross-agency reporting on Minnesota's surface water and groundwater conditions, and aligning discussions about gaps and opportunities to protect Minnesota's water. The third, to collaborate with the Climate Change Subcabinet to support information sharing and reporting on implementation and progress of Minnesota's Climate Action Framework. And the last being to develop and implement a process to regularly identify key environmental issues where EQB support and action can drive effective interagency coordination to improve information sharing and program alignment. So again, built on our conversations about convening and participating in interagency teams and working towards ensuring EQB kind of has those connecting spokes to share information in and out and ideas flowing between us and the member agencies. And we also talked about identifying the opportunities to serve in partnership with our member agencies. So the first 2 strategies here are really built on work already assigned to us by executive order or statute. The third, about the Climate Action Framework, has been something sort of loosely identified. And I've had some discussions with some folks at MPCA, but really hasn't been fully fleshed out. And the final strategy is really developmental, us taking some time to figure out how we can regularly assess situations and identify those opportunities that we have to support and increase interagency coordination on environmental issues. This one, probably the clearest one, the environmental review piece, probably the clearest in terms of what kinds of actions the strategies are going to lead to. So the strategies are to provide guidance and training to support responsible government units in completing EAWs in particular, to develop tools and guidance to support the inclusion of climate pollution and resiliency information in environmental review, to improve data collection to support EQB's ability to evaluate the effectiveness of Minnesota's environmental review program and our provision of technical assistance, and then to develop and implement updates to the rules to support program effectiveness and clarity in implementation. So I think our conversations here really focused on lifting up the technical assistance work that we do to provide the training and support the RGUs with our resources to some extent so that they're better equipped to do the work that they need to do, and so that we have a more consistent and effective environmental review process. And in the language in this draft plan, you will see that it's really described as including our work to continuously improve program effectiveness, and then using the pieces that we identify through the continuous improvement process as those markers of program effectiveness within the context of usable information, supporting engagement with the public, and following a sound process. So we're really trying to make sure we keep those markers of what is an effective program in front of us in this work as well. Finally, the last one, which was hardest, and I hope that it represents our discussion in terms of the disproportionate impacts. We had a discussion about the definition and what does that mean. I did add one. I chose to use one from the EPA's environmental justice work, which is long and says that people should be fully protected from disproportionate and adverse human health and environmental effects, including risks and hazards, including those related to climate change, the cumulative impacts of environmental and other burdens, and the legacy of racism or other structural or systemic barriers, and have equitable access to a healthy, sustainable, and resilient environment in which to live, play, work, learn, grow, worship, and engage in cultural and subsistence practices. One of the reasons I really like this definition is that it's not just about sort of preventing people from being exposed to environmental bads or environmental harms, but also speaks to them having access to environmental goods, environmental benefits. The strategies here really have a developmental orientation and are meant to reflect that they're still learning, or we're still learning. We want to gather the information about disproportionate effects where we can, share out that information and start to think about how we might be able to expand ways that we can identify disproportionate impacts. So the 4 strategies include identifying how EQB member agencies are working on disproportionate impacts and where there are tools or actions that can be used by EQB to ensure that all EQB reports provide information on equity and implementing the state's environmental goals, to explore possible frameworks and tools that could support consideration of the potential for disproportionate impacts in environmental review, and finally, to participate in conversations around cumulative impacts, considering how that framework relates to environmental review requirements and how it might be used to identify disproportionate impacts. So that, very briefly, is where the current draft stands. And for today, some of my questions for all of you are, do you see outcomes or strategies that don't fit with how you feel like our discussions went? Are there places that need more clarity or need different language? And finally, is this in good enough shape to go out for public input? Are there changes you would like to see? And just get your general sense of that. And that's all I had, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you, Director Nuschler. So yeah, do any board members have thoughts on what she was just posing as questions, or any additional questions for her strategic plan? Of course, go ahead and raise your hand or just jump in.
Madam Chair, this is Katrina.
Go ahead.
I'll just say, Catherine and EQB staff, I think it's great to get public input. I think the nature of the public facing work of the EQB lends itself to that. I still think it's very ambitious, and just put out there that, I don't know how many staff EQB has now, but it's not that many. And of course, the partner or member agencies do a lot of work in partnership with the EQB, including our agency representatives, tech reps. Just putting out there into the world that we need to manage expectations about what is possible, and given the resources that you have, and oftentimes the most effective strategic plans include, we will do this and by this date and we will report back. And I think we would be challenged to put those types of metrics together based on the ambitious boldness of this plan. That doesn't mean it isn't the right aspirational direction, but just wanting to make sure that everyone recognizes what is possible and what is aspirational.
Thank you, Commissioner Kessler, for those thoughts. And I have to admit, online, you faded out at the very end, so I don't think I heard a question in there at the end.
I don't have a question. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm just,
all right.
no one was saying anything, so I volunteered my thoughts.
I think I heard 95% of that.
Okay.
For the technology, I noticed when Kayla was talking earlier, and now again with Commissioner Kessler talking, you hear most of it, but it fades out a little bit from time to time. Great. How about other board members with any questions or comments?
I guess, so
this says July 2024 through June 2029. And we have a work plan that's already approved for this next year, right? So how are you thinking about the work, like, there's to Commissioner Kessler's point of like, that I agree, it's ambitious and often that's really helpful and sometimes it can be unhelpful if then there's too much ambition versus. So are you thinking then the work plan gets validated against this or that we're going to do a refresh? Like what should we expect to kind of get into the next steps?
I appreciate that question. And I think we started out this whole process and I said part of my goal is to align our aspirations with our capacity. So that has been in my head. If I recall, and my goal last summer was to do a work plan just for one fiscal year so that we could catch up to this and then have it line up. So yes, that's kind of my hope that if we go out now, we get some public comment and some input for the next month, and then we can, if it works, you know, assuming that this is what y'all want to move forward with and we figure that out in June or July, then we can build a work plan so it lines up. So yes, that's cool. Alignment. I mean, I think really that is how I see this, is then making choices about some of our work plan items and that most of them should fit in one of these.
Chair Daubenberger, this is Commissioner
Go-
Stroman, and I
go
can
ahead.
see we have hands online too, so if you want to switch to online, I'm happy to. I can't see who has a hand raised, I can just see a hand.
Why don't we go to you in the room and then we'll go to the online commenters. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair Daubenberger. So I'm gonna just pick up on the theme a little bit about while I think can be value, as Commissioner Arnold and Commissioner Kessler stated, in kind of that ambition, right? We want our strategic plan to be aspirational. I think one question I would have as we go out to public comment, what's the plan for sort of providing appropriate context for people who may be commenting on the plan? And, you know, do we have specific questions we're trying to get feedback on in terms of that? And just one example, right? If I look at goal, kind of that first goal or outcome in this strategy 3, create opportunities for partners and interested and affected people to bring forward key environmental issues for discussion. Right. I don't think we're intending like the place that you bring every idea pertaining to the environment is the EQB, right? Because there are multiple other agencies where it actually may be more effective to bring something specific to that agency. And so there's an example, you know, where I think to Commissioner Kessler's point, could create misalignment of expectations. And that isn't to say that people can't understand. I think they can, but right, there are a number of environmental agencies. So also helping the public create clarity about where it is most efficient to go with their ideas. And so I think there's also a way to address some of those issues in the way we go out for public comment that provides the appropriate context for, you know, how EQB is situated in that, and depending on how we intend to ask questions or solicit feedback from the public may help with that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Commissioner Stroman. I think that's a good point. On that particular item, I know we talked about being the space that's sort of some of the more cross-cutting issues. So I think trying to be more clear about that. That's a good thought. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment, Commissioner Stroman. And then let's go to Board Member Martin. Go ahead.
Thanks, Chair Daubenberger. Question for Director Nussler or Commissioner Kessler may have thoughts on this too. I'm on that last piece about disproportionate impacts and specifically, you know, how and whether disproportionate impacts analysis would become part of the environmental review process. It feels like there's probably a lot of potential overlap there with MPCA's ongoing cumulative impacts rulemaking, which I don't remember the exact time frame of, but I think that's going to be going on for the next year or two. So in the same time frame, I'm just curious, like, how will these two processes, you know, one a formal rulemaking and one just, you know, much less formal, but our strategic plan, how will they relate to each other, and how might we lean a little bit on the MPCA process if there is, you know, I suspect there might be quite a bit of overlap.
Chair Davenberger, this is Commissioner Kessler. I can
Go ahead,
try
Commissioner
to
Kessler.
address
Thank-
Board Member Martin's comment. So yes, the MPCA is working on cumulative impacts rules. We expect that it will be another couple years at least before that is done. And the vast majority of the time is making sure that we are getting the right level of input from the right communities and thoughtfully reflecting that in the administrative record as we develop the cumulative impacts framework. And for those of you who aren't as steeped in this as Board Member Martin, this is a new law that was passed last session and directs the MPCA for certain types of air permits to assess whether or not this air permitting action would disproportionately add a pollution burden in an environmental justice community. So if there's a new or expanded facility proposed already in an environmental justice community, if it's a certain size of facility, we would have to look at all of the other sources of pollution as well as other health metrics as part of that permitting decision. And so it's bold and new, and there's only one other place in the country that has something like this, which is in New Jersey. So it's fairly innovative in its nature. And it doesn't, in as much as these types of facilities might be going through environmental review would inform permitting, but Board Member Martin raises a question that I had about this particular strategy, which is how cumulative impacts are actually considered in environmental review. And I talked about this with Katrina Hecka, who is our tech rep and works in the environmental review program at the MPCA. And she reminded me that the vast majority of environmental review actions are EAWs, and those do not consider cumulative impacts in this way currently, and that might require some revisions to the environmental review process. So in environmental impact statement, which is a much bigger environmental review process, does evaluate more holistically the types of pollution that a project is a part of, but the EAWs do not. And so I just put that out there saying we don't have this all figured out yet. The ongoing rulemaking process that the MPCA is working on for cumulative impacts may inform the way that the EQB thinks about this. And certainly those meetings are open to the public, and we would invite people to come and listen and think about that as we try to address these various strategies. This is one where I am particularly curious how we will do this work.
Yeah, so
This is far beyond what I think is currently happening, and it is not clear to me who would do this and how it would get implemented.
and I can respond to that as well. Because it's actually the fourth one that says participate in conversations around cumulative impacts that where I had this process in mind when I was drafting it. And I think, as Commissioner Kessler said, you know, PCA is working on this idea of this cumulative impacts for air and air permits. And I have this sense that when people talk about cumulative impacts, they don't just want to talk about air. They maybe want to talk about other things, and that there might be some space for that in environmental review. And then in it, environmental review has to some degree the concept of cumulative impacts, but then also this idea of cumulative potential effects, which was defined and limited by the courts in the CARD decision in I think 2008 or 2009. And so there's that concept. And I believe it is part of the decision making for whether you need an EIS, that it has to be considered. So it's not totally outside of the bounds of environmental assessment worksheet. And so we're dealing with a bunch of these different concepts of cumulative impacts and what everybody sort of thinks of as cumulative impacts, what the environmental review rules have been interpreted to mean for cumulative impacts versus cumulative potential effects. And so what I'm interested in is just making sure we're starting to track all those conversations, to participate in them, to understand what the difference is, and to say like, well, what do people really want out of environmental review for understanding multiple things that are happening across the location, so that then we can figure out whether there are adaptations that need to be made for the program. Because I think, so certainly tracking the PCA rulemaking very closely is a key part of that. And that's why I left it to sort of participate in the conversations, to understand kind of the lay of the land and what's happening, so that we can then choose how to move forward.
Thank you, Director Nuschler. And I see Commissioner Arnold has her name tent on its side. Go ahead, Commissioner Arnold.
On this fourth outcome, I think the other thing that I would suggest being, I think it's kind of probably baked into strategy one, or maybe not strategy one, but thinking about the people who are working for EQB in addition to the work that EQB is doing, I think is really important. And I think as all the state agency leaders here, we have, when we're thinking about our equity goals or outcomes within our departments, we have not just external goals, we have internal ones too. And so I would encourage you to think about how to support development for your team and for the EQB team, so that it's sort of paralleling with the external conversations.
Like staff development and ideas.
Yeah, and I think you can probably pull from any of our strategic plans to see what I think there's some amount that are just the same across all agencies, and then there's some that are specific. And I think if you looked at each of our strategic plans, you could probably find language that, so you don't have to recreate the wheel.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you, Commissioner Arnold. Any other comments or questions from board members? Not seeing anything. Dean Nuschler, are there any other hands up or name tents up in the room?
I do not see any, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. And not seeing any online. So based on the comments, questions, I think we are good for this to go to public, up for public comment. So thanks for that. So with that, then we can move on to the next item on the agenda, but I should just do a check here. It is 2:05. It's 10 minutes ahead of time. Do we have the presenters for the next item, which is the state water plan?
Yes, Madam Chair, we have at least 3 of the 4. Is Tanny Eschenauer on the, yes, I'm seeing yeses. So yes, Madam Chair, I think we are good to go if our presenters want to come up to the front.
Right,
There's
as
name
they do
tags for
that.
you up
It's not clear where the front is.
Yeah, so we are going to hear about the state water plan tackling nitrate, and this is going to be presented by, well, first off, Executive Director Nuschler with the EQB, but then also Tanny Eschenauer, the Water Policy Manager from MDH, and Margaret Wagner from MDA, and Glenn Skuda, Watershed Division Director from the MPCA. So welcome, Catherine, Tanny, Margaret, and Glenn.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to my state agency colleagues who are willing to present. I'm going to stay over here, and then I'm going to walk over and hand you all the controls for the slides. All right, so thank you all for today's presentation. We're going to start with me. I'm going to give a brief overview of the state water plan and the issue of nitrate or nitrogen. I probably will use those interchangeably. In Minnesota's surface and groundwater, with a focus on nitrate in groundwater. We're then going to talk a little bit about the alignment between the state water plan developed by EQB and the actions needed to address an issue of concern that you've likely heard about lately, which is high levels of nitrate in groundwater that's used for drinking water in Southeast Minnesota. And then I will pass it off to my colleagues who are going to talk more about the actions that the agencies are taking to deal with the drinking water issue in Southeast Minnesota. So in collaboration with our sister agencies, the EQB does produce the state water plan as part of our statutory role in coordinating long-range water resources planning and policy. The current plan, which was developed in 2020, has a focus on climate and water. And specifically, the plan aims to set an agenda for dealing with those complex water issues that will be made even more challenging due to the impact of climate change. The state water plan includes 5 key goals, each of which are followed by strategies and actions. Several of the strategies and actions relate to responding to nitrate issues, and those strategies and actions primarily fall under Goal 1, Goal 2, and Goal 4. The issue of nitrate in surface water and groundwater is longstanding and complex. Nitrogen is critical for crop production, but it's prone under certain conditions to leach away from the place where it's useful, the crop root zone where it contributes to plant growth and into surface and groundwater. The form of nitrogen generally found in water resources, which is nitrate, at high levels can impact both human health and aquatic ecosystems, including fish and mussels. Although nitrate affects both surface and groundwater, today we will be focusing mainly on groundwater. Much of Minnesota receives this drinking water from groundwater, and so in many places, pollution in groundwater is a key issue for human health. Some parts of Minnesota have, due to their geology, particularly vulnerable groundwater that's more susceptible to being impacted by pollution from the land's surface. Southeast Minnesota, which has geology characterized by sinkholes and fractures, which is known as karst, is one of these areas, and these features allow quick movement of water from the surface to groundwater. Last fall, a petition was filed with EPA under the Safe Drinking Water Act, raising concern about the levels of nitrate in drinking water, and especially private wells in Southeast Minnesota. That and EPA's directives to the state in response has been driving significant conversation about nitrate and the need to reduce nitrate in groundwater, which is what we'll be talking more about today. Minnesota has strong monitoring data and information about nitrate in groundwater and surface water that informs and shapes our response to the issue of nitrate around the state. The data allows us to understand both whether we have levels of nitrate that are of concern and whether we can see a trend over time, whether nitrate levels are going up, going down, or are stable. As I said, today we're focusing on groundwater, but I do want to briefly mention that the state has goals for the loading of nitrogen in our rivers and streams, primarily both for our local actions, but also to help reduce the contribution to the Gulf of Mexico dead zone or area of hypoxia or low oxygen. Loading is the total amount of nitrogen that's being carried by the amount of water that's flowing, and it's particularly important for those downstream, such as the Gulf of Mexico. The data shows us that we have a long way to go to meet our goals for reducing nitrogen loads in rivers and streams. In Southeast Minnesota, nitrate levels are in places are high and are still increasing at several sites. In terms of groundwater, most of MPCA's shallow monitoring wells, which are designed to look at the uppermost and more vulnerable aquifers, are showing no change in nitrate trend. And more monitoring wells show nitrate decreases in nitrate concentrations rather than increases. But nitrate concentrations do remain high in many private drinking water wells. For example, MDA's township testing program, which ended in 2019, showed that from 2 to 8% of private drinking water wells exceed what's known as the health risk limit for nitrate. Nitrate concentrations, although the picture is mixed statewide, are clearly elevated in some areas and are influenced greatly by land use, geology, the age of the groundwater, the time frame assessed, and other factors such as the well construction, depth, and age. So the state water plan really includes the existing foundation of a lot of the work that the state is doing and strategies and actions that already and will continue to help reduce nitrate around the state. And I'll just note many of the actions in the water plan, the actions the agencies are taking are being funded by the Clean Water Fund. I want to emphasize overall, I think we know what the key actions are that will reduce nitrate, and the impact of those actions really depends on where we deploy them and how we focus them. think it's very easy for us to talk about our different programs and the way they are funded and the way they work, but fundamentally, they're working towards many of the same key actions. And to tackle this issue, the state needs to accelerate, scale up, and continue to innovate. In response to the nitrate petitions and the EPA directives, the state agencies are going to be using all of the tools they have to protect human health and the environment. And the work is going to proceed in 3 phases. MDH is leading phases 1 and 2, which is the immediate response that focuses on protecting human health from high nitrate in drinking water by understanding who's being exposed and working to break those exposure pathways. MDA and MPCA are leading phase 3, which is the long-term work to prevent and minimize nitrate making it into the state's water resources, focusing on reducing the levels of nitrate being applied or discharged and ensuring that the nitrate stays where it's put. And then, as I said, all of these strategies and actions really align with those laid out in the state water plan. So at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Tanny from the Department of Health to talk about the public health response.
All right. Well, thank you, Director, and thank you for the invitation to come today and talk about our response plan for Southeast Minnesota and the nitrate contamination there. And I just want to begin by circling back to the people part of this, and that there is a definite public health concern from nitrate. We're concerned about fish and bugs in the Gulf as well, but for infants under 1 year of age, due to their infant hemoglobin and the acidity in their stomach and other conditions, they are more vulnerable to health effects from nitrate and a condition known as blue baby syndrome or methemoglobinemia. And there's also potential for health effects to pregnant people. And so they are the primary populations about which we are concerned. There is some increasing evidence for other health effects for other members of the population, but that really hasn't solidified yet. And so our health risk assessment staff say that drinking water at 10 milligrams per liter and below is safe for everyone. And also just to note that wells that are at higher risk are wells that are pre-code, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Next slide, please. So I just want to give a little bit of background about private wells and private well owners, private well users in the state of Minnesota. They tend to fly under the radar. And so we estimate that there's about 1 million private well users in Minnesota, although we don't actually know. We don't know where all the private wells are located in the state. We didn't begin recording it until after the passage of our state well code. And so there's some other estimates that as many as 1/3 of Minnesotans are using private drinking water wells as their primary source of drinking water. So on the map, you see a map that has little green dots for each of the wells that we know exist. And I'll also note that in Southeast Minnesota, in these 8 counties that we're talking about today, the percentage is higher. It ends up being about 1 in 4, or almost 100,000 people rely on private drinking water wells. Next slide. So another comparison that we like to make is between the protections that are in place for customers of a public water supply system. So largely, you know those as community or city water systems, systems that provide water to people where they live, and the difference with private wells. Well construction for both groups is highly regulated. Where you can construct a well and how it is constructed, that has to meet the requirements of the Minnesota Well Code. Likewise, at the end of the useful life of a well, the way that the well is sealed has to meet certain requirements. But the disparity exists over the lifespan of the well. With the Safe Drinking Water Act, that federal law which MDH implements in the state of Minnesota, there's regular testing to ensure that the water is safe. There is mitigation if contaminants are found above a safe level. There's extensive work now, especially enhanced through our Clean Water Fund, to protect source waters in collaboration with our sister water agencies. And then there's a sizable amount of funding for construction of new drinking water treatment plants, for repair and for sealing. but there is no parallel for a private well owner or a private well user. Maybe they don't own the well, maybe they're a renter. And so MDH is particularly concerned about this population. Things have changed since our well code was put into practice in 1974. We know more about the toxicology of contaminants like arsenic, and also land use has changed in ways that mean that while our well code provides a significant degree of protection, it is often not enough. And the reliance on the savvy of the well owner is a challenge. And finally, I'll just note that well users, they don't get to choose their geology, and they also have little to no influence on how land is used around them. Next slide, please. So today we're going to be focusing on nitrate. That's the contaminant that often gets the headlines, but we just want to remind you that we're concerned about more than nitrate, and that the only way to know if there's a contaminant in your drinking water as a private well owner or user is to test. And we recommend that the people use an accredited lab. You can't taste contaminants, you can't smell them, you can't see them. And so the 5 contaminants that we're focused on are nitrate and coliform bacteria, because those cause acute health conditions like GI problems, tummy problems. And then we want people to test at least once for arsenic, lead, and manganese. Arsenic and manganese come from the geology, and arsenic is a known human carcinogen. Lead, we don't expect to be in the source water for a private well, but it can come from parts from older wells when they were constructed, like packers, or from premise plumbing, so solder or fixtures in people's homes. And we have some evidence about the prevalence of these contaminants across the state of Minnesota, but our data on this is pretty scattered and not always in forms that we can easily use. Next slide, please. So when we come to private wells, it's not really a science or a technology issue as much as it is a socioeconomic kind of issue, because it depends on people's behaviors and people's choices. And so we did a survey back in 2016 of people who we knew had high arsenic results in their wells. And the first sample that was taken after a well is constructed, the one sample that's required for a private well. And we were surprised at the results. These were people that had been drinking from their wells, could be for many, many years, and less than 20% tested for any contaminant at the recommended frequency. And of more concern was these people got results saying that their arsenic level was above the public drinking water standard, and more than a third did not take any action to reduce the amount of arsenic in their drinking water. The others either relied on bottled water or who had installed a treatment system. So this is a great concern for us. Next slide, please. So when we look at private drinking water wells, we want to reassure the people of Southeast Minnesota and those 8 counties that the safe drinking water is effective in protecting them and their drinking water that is safe. For private wells, it's a different story because their water safety depends on the initiative and the vigilance of the owner. And we have been working for some time to increase routine private well testing through the Clean Water Fund initiative, and this relates directly to the state water plan. In 2021, we offered 2 pilot grants to partnerships between local public health and soil and water conservation districts. Based on learning that we did with those 2, we have offered 6 new grants. We're calling them phase 1 grants because there'll be new partnerships that we're entering into, and those 2 previous grantees will have another round of funding. We're also working on a private well stewards network in collaboration with the University of Minnesota. We held a private well forum. Over 200 people participated in a day-long series of presentations about private wells. And because this is a socioeconomic kind of problem, we're working with the U to understand more about people's knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors when it comes to private wells. Next slide, please. So as the director mentioned, Last April, there was a petition to the US EPA. They gave a letter with 7 directives in it to the agencies. In November of last year, the agencies responded with a robust response plan in January of this year. So I'm just going to touch on several parts of that plan. The directives require that we find all the private wells. I mentioned earlier that we don't have comprehensive well inventories for private wells across the state, that we provide notification, education, and outreach. Folks who are on community water systems, that's highly regulated, and so there's a public notification process in place. For private wells, there has been less to this point beyond telling them the results of their initial water quality sample. The EPA requires that we offer free testing for all private wells in these 8 counties, that we offer free mitigation for wells that exceed the drinking water guidance, our health risk limits, which is the same as the public drinking water standard. And then they emphasize that the public needs to have access to the data that we have from our work down there and records about our activities and how fast we're moving forward on this. And of course, we need to report back to EPA Region 5. Next slide, please. So as the director mentioned, we've divided our response into 3 phases based on the EPA directives. We have a phase 1, which started in January when we filed our plan and goes through June 30th. That's the end of our fiscal year. And for this, we're using existing funding. We have found a little bit more to help out and really beefing up our education and outreach strategies using our Clean Water Fund dollars. Then phase 2 would begin on July 1st, so the beginning of our state fiscal year, and run through the next year. And that's where our full-blown public health intervention would take place. And then my colleagues from the Department of Agriculture and the Pollution Control Agency will share more about phase 3, which really continues existing activities and then moves on into the future. Next slide, please. So a little more detail about what we're doing between now and June. We've been doing a lot of outreach and education through social media and a news release, and we're planning on doing some radio spots and some billboards that are targeted to that southeast region of the state. We, as you'll learn later, we're working closely with the Tap In Collaborative, and they also have a lot of outreach and education materials, so working with them to make sure that they're high profile. Then we're trying to provide limited alternate water for vulnerable households. So households with pregnant people or a baby under 1 year of age. Our colleagues at MDA have some funding available to provide reverse osmosis treatment for people who participated in their township testing, which I'm sure Margaret will tell you more about. And then we were able to secure a small amount of money to provide free testing for the 5 contaminants that we recommend and bottled water, but only to those high priority households, so households with pregnant people and an infant under 1 year of age. Next slide, please. So phase 2 is our public health intervention. And so during that phase, depending on the funding that we receive, we plan to conduct a well inventory using student interns through various strategies that have been used by the Minnesota Geological Survey in the past. We'll continue our education and outreach. Our private well stewards work with the university will be put into place first in these 8 counties in the state. There's a number of items listed on this slide. We'll offer free private well testing for nitrate, and we'll do that in collaboration with the Southeast Minnesota Water Analysis Lab, who has a great track record in being able to mail out test kits and getting them back to the lab within the hold time. We'll provide mitigation, so that could be the reverse osmosis systems, which have been found to be effective in reducing nitrate. We'll also, depending on the situation of the specific well, offer well repairs or new well construction, because we know ultimately the best solution over the long term is to have a well constructed according to the well code. We have fair amount of evidence showing that many or most of the wells with high nitrate are pre-code wells. However, the other thing to keep in mind is that it all depends on having a safe drinking water aquifer to be able to finish that well in. And so we too are hopeful for our colleagues' efforts to reduce nitrate inputs into those drinking water aquifers. And then we'll also provide a public record of work. We'll use data visualization techniques and maps to help folks down there understand where nitrate is in the aquifers in southeast Minnesota and provide a dashboard on our progress. So there's a public record of our work. Next slide, please. I mentioned this collaborative that was established through one of our pilot grants. The grants were actually offered to local public health or soil and water conservation districts or other local partners. In both cases, the one that was for West Central Minnesota for arsenic and now the one for nitrate, local public health and SWCDs chose to work together because they have complementary skill sets that are really important in this work. And one of the most exciting things about this pilot grant in southeast Minnesota was after our grant dollars were complete, the Tap-In Collaborative decided to continue their work together and added more counties. So originally it was 6 counties. They added Rice County and they've expanded to add an additional 2. So they include the 8 counties plus 1 more. And we're just really excited about this increase in local capacity to address the needs of private well owners. All right, next slide, and I believe I'll hand it back to the director.
Thank you, Tanny. And I'm going to have Jesse have to advance a couple slides because I gave away the clicker a little early. Again, I just want to emphasize as we begin to talk about long-term strategies and actions to reduce nitrate in water, again, that the practices that keep nitrate from moving to water from cropland, that the practices to have the right amount of nitrogen used and keep it in place in the soil generally work everywhere. There might be some slight differences based on geology or climate or crops, but I think fundamentally, at least to my policy non-science brain, they're very similar. And those strategies and practices include, making land use changes that result in less pollution, such as changing row crop spaces to prairie or woodland or wetland, using the right amount of manure or fertilizer and applying it at the right time, and using crops and cropping systems that minimize nitrogen losses and promote soil health, and then direct discharge of nitrate as well. And that the impact really depends on where these are implemented or installed. So are the soil health or crop systems practices placed in areas with vulnerable groundwater and where a lot of people have private wells? Or is the land cover type changed in an area that recharges a well serving a city water supply? All of those things are what is going to impact all of those changes and where they happen drives how we're going to see the impacts. And then there's a whole bunch of voluntary pathways, incentives and grants and different programs, and maybe a few regulatory ones to get those in place. And if I should say that I'm trying to set a general stage here, but these folks are the experts. And so I'm sure if I misspeak on anything, they will correct the record. I think though in the state world and where, as you see in the state water plan and the goals and strategies, we often divide up how we talk about the issue based on the location, based on where we want to target the strategies or the actions, based on the specific areas where we want to reduce nitrate, or based on the program that's being used to incentivize or to otherwise require the action. And so we separate working around public water systems from working in areas with lots of private wells, and we separate voluntary programs from things that might be required by rules. And so I wanted to really emphasize this bigger connection about the actions and strategies as the agencies talk about their different pieces. And I'm going to briefly pass it back to Tanny at this point to just give us a little grounding in source water protection.
Sorry, forgot to turn on my screen there for a moment. Okay, source water protection is the language that we use to talk about protecting the sources of our public water system. So looking at rivers, lakes, and groundwater across the state, and in some cases, former mine pits. And in particular, when it comes to groundwater, it's a way of defining the area on the land surface which will drain to that public water supply well, recharge it. And we use a 10-year time of travel to define that. And then the second piece of it is it would be hard to outline that on the land surface. So we take local landmarks, and those are easily seen on the surface, and those are what we use in order to define it for that community water system, the area that they're required to protect. Next slide, please. So I talked about the drinking water supply management area, or DWSMAs. That's the formal name for these source water protection areas. I'll just mention that we also have them for surface water systems, where we look at an 8-year time of travel or 24-year hour time of travel to the surface water intake. And if we look at the area protected for groundwater systems across the state, there's about 1.2 million acres, and 400,000 of those acres, or 36%, are vulnerable to contamination. And there really isn't a parallel for this for private wells, which is challenging. Our well code does provide for setbacks, how far a private well needs to be from a building, from a septic tank, and so on. But some of the bigger influences that are further away or outside of a person's property are outside of their control. Next slide, please. So our source water protection program is really well developed. We work in collaboration with these community water systems. We have modeling to help them define those sources. That's called Part A of our drinking water supply management plans. They are then handed off to a wellhead management team, which looks at different potential sources of contamination within the drinking water supply management area. And then those systems are required to lay out activities or measures that they will take over the next 10 years in order to protect their water supply. And then there is a system of checking to see whether or not those different activities are taking place. And I'll just mention that a new highlight on our website is a story map that highlights some of our success stories in protecting source water areas. Next slide. So when it comes to our overall work that we do in the state through the local comprehensive water management strategies, we work hard to get our drinking water concerns incorporated into those plans. And a special function that we have at the health department, but we do in collaboration with our sister water agencies, is to take the existing groundwater data that we have for the state. Unlike the surface water intensive watershed monitoring, we're not getting new data, but we take it and we compile it both in a written report and then on an online watershed health assessment framework sponsored by our colleagues at the Department of Natural Resources, in order to make this data easily accessible to those local planners. And as is mentioned in the slide, lots of those tools rely on land management decisions because that strongly influences the quality of the groundwater. And it's often private land acres, and that's why we rely for our private well work more and more on soil and water conservation districts, because they are key collaborators when it comes to working with private well or private landowners. Next slide, please. Okay, I think this is where I hand it off to Margaret, correct?
Yep. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Margaret Wagner, and I manage the non-point fertilizer section at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And today I'll talk about MDA's activities related to nitrate and make some of those connections between the existing state water plan and our work related to the EPA petition. So the Department of Agriculture is concerned about nitrates in groundwater and in drinking water and has taken significant action to address this concern. Passage of the Clean Water, Land and Legacy Amendment has really provided funding, allowing us to accelerate and fully implement the strategies and to address nitrates in vulnerable areas of the state. So MDA's strategies, as I'll outline today, include the nitrogen fertilizer management plan and our groundwater protection rule. And together, this really represents a voluntary and regulatory approach to address this concern. So the nitrogen fertilizer management plan is the state's blueprint for addressing nitrate in groundwater. It was written in 1990 after the passage of the Groundwater Protection Act. But funding and staff was limited for a number of years. And so one of the first things that we did with the Clean Water Fund was actually update this plan. So make the investment in the strategy. And so within this, it really outlines a process, and it outlines a process for assessing vulnerable areas of the state, testing private wells, promoting, and in some cases requiring practices in those areas, refining our survey and assessment tools, computer modeling to aid in the selection of practices, and then a very intentional, locally based approach to promote and adopt protective practices for groundwater in these key areas. So a key outcome of the nitrogen fertilizer management plan was the township testing program. So it was briefly mentioned earlier in the presentation, but over a 7-year period, the department offered testing in areas with vulnerable groundwater. So that's inclusive of Southeast, the Central Sands region, as well as Southwest Minnesota. And across those 3 regions offered private well testing at no cost to the homeowner to 90,000 private residents in Minnesota. And the goal there was really to characterize nitrate conditions in these vulnerable areas. And the outcome is this accurate and recent information about what are the conditions of drinking water that Minnesotans are drinking. And as noted, this was used by environmental organizations, this data set, to really emphasize the concern in this region. So it was really the state's data that helped us understand and characterize this region and then move forward with some action. The MDA also uses this data to prioritize our work. So as we think about areas of the state that we are working in directly with farmers and their crop advisors, it aligns with these areas that tested high in our township testing program. Additionally, we support regional monitoring networks, so a little bit more focused area, long-term monitoring where we can look at trends within these critical areas. We have nested monitoring wells where we have additional monitoring at different scales in Southeast. We have continuous nitrate sensing technology and tile drainage streams and springs in Southeast. We've worked on age dating with the U.S. Geologic Survey to understand lag times and groundwater age, and really bringing a lot of this foundational science together in educational videos that were recent in the last few years have been released in Southeast. So really bringing that science together to understand what are the conditions and also what are some of those concerns. And then another major outcome of the nitrogen fertilizer management plan was the groundwater protection rule. This was passed in 2019, and the new rule minimizes potential sources of nitrate pollution to the state's groundwater and protects our drinking water. There are 2 parts to that rule, and I'll quickly walk through those. So part 1 of the rule restricts fall application of commercial fertilizer in areas with vulnerable groundwater, which is denoted those purple areas on the map, and in drinking water supply area management areas, which Tanny introduced us to. So those areas that are delineated around a community water supply, those I'll refer to as DWISMAs. So the fall fertilizer and winter application of commercial fertilizer restrictions apply in the purple and green areas on the map. That represents about 12% of cropland across Minnesota. And then in Southeast, if we just focus in on that area, these new fall fertilizer restrictions apply to 71% of the cropland in that area, about 1.1 million acres. And this part of the rule went into effect on September 1st, 2020, and every year it goes into effect, so fall application is restricted in these areas. And then part 2 of the rule applies specifically to drinking water supply management areas, those delineated DWISMAs around community water supplies. And it affects communities where the water supply has elevated nitrate. So if that nitrate level in the community water supply is at 5.4 milligrams per liter, but less than 8, that community is designated as level 1. If it's at 8 parts per million or milligrams per liter or projected to exceed 10 milligrams per liter in a 10-year period, it's designated as level 2. So currently there are 10 level 1 communities in Minnesota, 18 level 2 communities, and 4 communities where we've delayed that for good cause. Specifically, we're looking at point source reviews and collecting additional sampling in that area to determine if the source of nitrate in the well is connected with commercial fertilizer. So it is within the level 2, as I mentioned, there's 18 of these communities, and they're hard to see, but they're denoted with the red dots. So it's within those red dots, those communities, that we convene a local advisory team, which is a big part of our strategy.
This is made up of farmers and crop retailers. We've established 18 of these local advisory teams since 2021, and we're working through a process to identify what practices will be required. It's important to note that as part of this rule, we start at a voluntary level, and then there's criteria to move to a regulatory level. So as we work initially in all of these communities, we are working on a voluntary level, and then we can move to regulation and require practices under 2 conditions. One, if the BMPs that the local advisory team and the Department of Agriculture publishes are not adopted on 80% of that cropland acre. So we do go out, we evaluate and assess those practices, and if they're not adopted on 80%, at least 80% of the acres, we move to a regulatory level. Additionally, if water quality gets statistically worse, so if we really have a concern and the water quality continues to get worse, that's another trigger that can move us to a regulatory level. So really, the nitrogen fertilizer management plan and the groundwater protection rule provides a framework. And it's within that framework was where the MDA's work really aligns with the state water plan. So it's under that umbrella of the rule and the plan that's really our technical programs and a lot of the work that we do day to day. So a major goal for protecting water is to promote best management practices. And this has a special meaning. It's the guidance provided by the University of Minnesota. And then in vulnerable areas, it's really about promoting practices that go beyond those best management practices, are often referred to as the 4 R's. We talk a lot about rate and timing and placement of fertilizer, but in these highly vulnerable areas, we're thinking about what can we do beyond that. And this often includes low nitrogen crops and vegetative cover in these high risk areas. So the MDA works with multiple partners on all of the activities. This includes a lot of our on-farm research with the University of Minnesota and updates to the nitrogen fertilizer BMPs based on that research. We have critical are our nitrogen rate trials that feed directly into the guidance that farmers get about appropriate rates for nitrogen application. We support this through something called the Nutrient Management Initiative, where we work with about 100 farmers a year to test those on-farm rates. So we're looking at outcomes from maybe their normal rate, looking at a 30-pound reduction, or looking at timing and the influence that a split application could have in that operation. The BMPs are really a starting point as we start to talk about practices. That's where we enter a lot of these conversations. We use in-depth surveys, so we're actually surveying farmers and crop advisors, knowing that practices change. The starting point for a lot of these local advisory teams is to do those surveys, understand what our baseline is, and then we have modelers or researchers are on staff that really use robust modeling to compare, okay, here are the current practices and here are some scenarios for nitrogen reduction and groundwater protection. And it's those tools that we then come back to our teams with as we look at options for implementation. So an important strategy for groundwater protection is vegetative cover. This is very prominent in the state water plan as well as the work of the Department of Agriculture. So promoting these practices is really important as we think about these vulnerable areas. We support this work through on-farm demonstrations. So we have a lot of work that's in Southeast, but also other areas of the state. We have evaluation and use edge of field monitoring. So real-time monitoring, really looking at the impact of the water quality impact of these practices. And we promote a lot of this work specifically then back within the DWISMAs. Currently, we're supporting 12 applied research projects, 13 on-farm projects, and some of that is through our work in the Central Sands at the Rocheville Farm, which is located in Pope County, and really a important partnership with the Pope County SWCD that allows us to reach out to that ag community. We also have partnerships with the Forever Green Initiative at the University of Minnesota. It's through this partnership that actually the first commercial acres of perennial Kernza in Minnesota were planted within a vulnerable business. So we're really leveraging many of the programs across the state. There's additional cost share for Kernza, which is shown in the picture on the bottom there, but it's a perennial grain with a really dense and long root structure that allows to take up nitrogen, as well as not needing a lot of nitrogen input for the production of that grain. So it has a great environmental benefit and really working on the commercialization and economic viability of that. We're also looking at other winter annuals and have supported an implementation cost share program where farmers can get additional cost share to plant these pretty new crops that are here in Minnesota. So as we think about practices and priorities, it's important to note that as we promote groundwater protection, this is really similar and often the same as the practices for soil health. So there's a lot of synergy between soil health initiatives that we've been talking about, staff capacity and promotion of those practices, and work on groundwater protection. And we're taking advantage of this as we work with other agencies and align our strategies. So I wanted to share one example of perennial cover. So what does this mean to look at adoption within DWISMAs and really targeted areas through these teams? So the graph on the left shows that perennial cover is increasing in 2018 to 2021 at the same time that we're seeing declines in existing nitrate and groundwater. So really, this is a great example of partnerships and all the partnerships that came together to promote these practices and really the local leadership. So this isn't a direct outcome of the groundwater protection rule. This is an outcome of a lot of the local leaderships and years of promotion of these practices in the area. So we know this takes multiple years, and sometimes we're just building on the efforts that locals have been working on in these areas. So we're looking at this monitoring data closely. We know that we've had a few dry years within this, and sometimes those dry conditions can hold nitrate in the soil profile. So we're not indicating entirely that this decline in nitrate is just due to the land use cover, but we're watching this really closely. These are the types of responses that we're hoping to see within these DWISMAs. So we have similar tracking of cropland in all of our DWISMAs under the rule, looking for those same types of proportional changes as we think about opportunities for cover crops, alfalfa, existing forages, as well as some of these new crops or easement programs. And I mentioned it, but it's worth mentioning again that partnerships are critical in this work. And so as we look at the work that we do, we have partnerships with 36 soil and water conservation districts across the state to really deliver many of these programs. And everything I presented today is with SWCDs, University of Minnesota researchers, and with our other state agencies. As we look at implementation funding in these areas, we're really relying on the Board of Soil and Water Resources. They're key programs to help us provide that cost share and make it really viable for farmers to adjust those practices or minimize risk as they try out a new practice. Nitrate is complex and challenging. It requires multiple approaches, and what we believe it really needs to be targeted and locally adapted. Funding for this work, as I mentioned, has been key to help us really accelerate this work and some of the outcomes that I've highlighted today. So much of our funding currently comes from the Clean Water Fund. We do have a direct appropriation for nitrates and groundwater. And I've illustrated that's really where the township testing data, monitoring, as well as this implementation work is supported. About 50% of those dollars are passed through to our local partners. So we really think about pass through as well as leveraging. We've been able to leverage with those clean water dollars over $5 million in federal funding. So the Regional Conservation Partnership Program grants, as well as NRCS EQIP funding. So those are the types of things that we're really positioning these areas to be able to attain. We have technical assistance programs that focuses a lot on edge of field monitoring. I hope some of you are familiar with the Root River Field to Stream Partnership, long-term monitoring and farmer leadership in Southeast that's really resulted in a lot of positive outcomes in that area. We also have a soil health assistance program. So thinking about not only can we promote practices, but farmers need to be able to implement them. So this is key to having equipment available that can support practices like cover crop adoption or minimize tillage, changing we have a great example in Southeast where we're seeing water quality benefits from changing from a more common manure application in the fall to a low disturbance. So purchasing is seen a $50,000 piece of equipment, but allowing lower disturbance in the fall when the manure has to be on the field has allowed cover crops to actually establish. So something that was really challenging with traditional equipment is now possible with conservation-minded equipment. We also have ag BMP loans that can be invested to really mitigate any or reduce any water quality concern. That's a great match for grants that require another investment. As I mentioned, we work really closely with Forever Green. There's an appropriation directly to the department that's passed through to the university. We have the Minnesota Ag Water Quality Certification Program. Our strategy in Southeast is to really accelerate that. So we're looking to add additional capacity. We do have a list of interested producers in that certification program, and we want to make sure we can work through that list and get those certified. And then a new ag weather station network that's really about local ag weather data so that farmers can respond to that and make agronomic decisions based on their local data. So that's from irrigation decisions to when they spray pesticides, and that really is important to consider weather conditions. So to finish up, the long-term strategy will require us to accelerate, scale up, and really innovate this approach that I've laid out. We'll continue to work in the drinking water supply management areas in a voluntary effort. If that's not successful, we'll move to a regulatory a regulatory framework in those areas. We'll also continue to work outside of the drinking water supply management areas. So we, in a voluntary manner, we're going to move into townships. So that's kind of the scale that we're going to be starting to implement additional work is in called high-risk townships, but we're going to look back at that township testing data and those communities that had greater than 10% of their private wells over that 10 parts per million HRL. That's where we're going to focus our work. So we're going to be convening local advisory teams and working through that same kind of standardized process of assessing practices and then promoting the adoption. We'll work with new local advisory teams, partnerships with ag retailers. We're really looking for leadership from the ag retailer, and we continue to have conversations there. We're working with Forever Green to look at economically viable cover. Recently supported a small grant program to look at markets and supply chains for these new crops. It's just a critical piece to actually getting them adopted. So we want more perennials and winter annuals, but they need to make economic sense. So we have additional grant dollars to think about scaling up those support for the production of those crops. So we've really, I hope I've illustrated and communicated here that the department through our work has really contributed to the foundational science and our understanding of both how groundwater moves in this area and contaminants like nitrate move within this landscape. We have a strategy, as I've mentioned, that's been through extensive public comment review, and we're now really at a point of implementing that science-based and locally delivered strategy. And we acknowledge it'll take time, but we are very committed to this and continue to have this as a high priority. Pass it to Glenn.
Stand up so I can see a little bit better and see you as well. If that's okay. So you've been going for almost an hour on this item. Are you okay? Stand up for a minute. Need a break, or do you want to just go? Go ahead. Okay.
Don't stand too close to that camera though, no one will be able to see your face.
Very good. Well, that's not a problem. But, so I only have 10 slides and I'll try not to belabor anyone. So Margaret just addressed the non-bolded bullets on the left side and the top one on the right. I'm going to hit the bolded bullets here. On the first one, in terms of ensuring compliance with Minnesota feedlot rules, and maybe I should back up a second. So I'm Glenn Skuda. I'm the Watershed Division Director with the Pollution Control Agency. So in my division, I have the feedlot program and I have the watershed program. The feedlot program is a compliance and enforcement program overseeing large animal agriculture permits, and also working in collaboration with 50 counties in the state that have delegation from us to oversee the smaller animal agriculture. Watershed program provides watershed science primarily to local units of government in their local water planning and implementation efforts. So I'm going to address some of the things that my division and the Pollution Control Agency as a whole is doing related to this issue of nitrates. All right, so feedlots. I'll just make a vague statement in terms of compliance with feedlot rules. We do have a good feedlot program for oversight of large animal agriculture. We compare well when we talk with EPA Region 5 compared to the other states in our region in terms of the amount of compliance and enforcement activity that we do. We are a heavy livestock agriculture state compared to many others. So we have a lot of facilities here, but we do a good job with them. That said, we're still only able to really get out to a pretty small percentage of our facilities. And so the big statement I'll say is as we look towards next biennium's budget, we'll be looking at if we put in and ask for enhancing the program to provide us more resources to get out a bit more to ensure compliance with the existing feedlot rules. But then, so now I'm going to really focus on the permits, the general permits that we have for the feedlot program, and then the feedlot rules. And for context, talking about Southeast Minnesota, just so you have a sense of the size of what we're talking about here. There are about 2,600 feedlots in Southeast Minnesota that are registered. Less than 100 of them actually are of the size where they need a permit. 1,000 animal unit size, 1,000 animal units being like an animal unit being, you know, a steer. So most of the facilities down there are smaller in size. So again, we, as the state, regulate the permitted facilities, and then the counties regulate the smaller facilities. Unless they haven't accepted delegation, then we oversee the smaller facilities in those counties as well. 5 years ago, we reissued The, I missed a slide here. I think a slide got dropped. Okay. All right, we did reissue the NPDS, which is our federal permit that we enforce. 5 years ago, we reissued that. It's a 5-year permit. And we added additional requirements into the permit at that time. And that's to address this particular issue of nitrates. So additional requirements for cover crops and manure management in the fall, restrictions on tightening the window of when application of solid manure is allowed in the wintertime, already a restriction on liquid manure application. So we tightened up that permit a bit 5 years ago to start to address this issue. Those, as a 5-year permit, it's about to expire, it needs to be renewed. And also the state permit, SDS, State Disposal System Permit, is a 10-year term. So every 10 years, those expirations essentially sync up. So that one is expiring now as well. And so we will be incorporating those requirements that we put into the permit 5 years ago for the national permit into the state permit as well. So they will be synced up with each other in terms of the type of requirements that they require. And so we will be putting those on public notice shortly. We're working with EPA to get their comments on our permit. And so we're looking to get those on public notice likely this summer and be a concurrent public comment period. Some of the additional so in addition to making the state permit in line with what we have in the federal permit, we're looking at some additional requirements again to continue to address the issue of nitrates, requiring incorporation and injection of manure in floodplains, requiring visual inspections of land application fields on the days that application is done to be aware if there is any discharges happening, if something went wrong with the way the manure was applied. And then if there is any discharge happening, to ensure that that's contained, that's reported, and address that. Tightening up manure transfer regulations, there's a little bit of a gap in terms of our understanding of where that manure is going when manure is transferred. So with manure management planning changes in the permit, we'll have a more complete understanding of where the manure is going, and also a ability to map where it is going to ensure that we're not seeing over application. And then also increasing the requirements and restrictions on manure application to vulnerable fields. So in vulnerable duismas, like Margaret was talking about, shallow soils over bedrock, and then of course textured soils like the central sands, as well of course the karst area of the state. And these are statewide permits, so these address not only Southeast Minnesota, but the state as a whole. That's the permit changes that we made 5 years ago and that we're moving forward with additional changes now or soon. We're also looking to open up the feedlot rules for amendment, which has not been done meaningfully really in a couple of decades. So we are going to be starting that process later this year. Need to do a bit more research and making sure that what, of course, in any rulemaking, that changes we make are needed and reasonable. But these are some things that in our response to EPA's, the petition to EPA and the work plan that we put in, and things that we will be considering that we have indicated include, again, these. And so a lot of these things are maybe going to be already in the permits now, and we'll be making them parts of the rule, which will bring some of these requirements down to apply to smaller facilities, and figuring out to what size is going to be a big part of that. But requirements on transferred manure, land application sensitive areas, requiring more manure storage capacity to ensure that manure application will happen at times that will avoid high risk runoff situations. When folks don't have enough storage, they can sometimes end up applying at riskier times. So addressing that issue. Submittal of manure management plans for smaller feedlots that are currently required. Increasing setbacks for where manure is applied, setbacks from sensitive features. And also looking at the rate requirements for manure application, so that again, we're not applying too much manure. So that's the rule. Right now, there is a active bill at the legislature for a statutory change. This is a joint effort between Department of Agriculture and the PCA to help ensure solid implementation of the groundwater protection rule that Margaret was describing. The way the rules and statutes are structured right now, everything Margaret talked about applies when commercial fertilizer is being applied alone or commercial fertilizer is being applied with manure. But if it's only manure application, the rule doesn't apply and they can't implement everything that Margaret was talking about. So this statute basically closes, so to speak, that loophole and says, okay, if you're just applying manure in a vulnerable to ISMA, you still have to meet the requirements of the groundwater protection rule. So it just brings a level playing field there. Makes sense. We did have a situation about a year and a half ago in far southwest Minnesota where a landowner was asked, or operator was asked to meet the level 2 requirements of the groundwater protection rule, and they, rather than reduce the amount of nitrogen putting on, they decided to just switch over to manure so that they didn't have to. So that is not helping the situation there. So this type of statutory change would help prevent that sort of thing from occurring. All right, so that was the feedlot program, rules, statutes, permits. Within the watershed program, we oversee the 10 years ago, the development of, and now the revision of the state's nutrient reduction strategy. So PCA facilitates it, but it is a state strategy. It's owned by all the agencies together. There's a steering team that's made up of all the state agencies, also with some federal involvement from some of the federal agencies too. So we are in the process of updating that strategy. Again, it's about 10 years old. So revamping that right now, finishing it up in about a year and a half. And it's that combination of, identifying and addressing what are the best management practices, what is the science, the goals, the targets, the tools, everything that we need to get at this issue of losing less nutrients down our waterways out of our state. Again, this is a statewide strategy, but that dovetails with local watershed work and best management practice adoption. It's a state strategy, but it has benefits for local waters, local implementation. This strategy informs the local water planning efforts, as well as the distant needs of places like the Gulf of Mexico and Lake Winnipeg and the Great Lakes. Every state I'm not sure about the whole country, but for sure the Mississippi Basin has a nutrient reduction strategy because EPA basically called for these a decade ago and has been providing actually some funding to have these developed and now updated as well. And so ours has been used quite well in the state for our local water planning efforts, for state efforts as well. It's been used as other states as a model. I know talking to Wisconsin, they said, yep, we took yours and used that as our base and then went from there. So these are kind of the 6 focus areas as we revamp the strategy right now. Really looking at what is the latest science on nutrient conservation for agricultural best management practices that we should really be promoting, with continuous living cover being a key, as has been mentioned previously. I think a key question, we have so these are 6 work groups that we have addressing these, is really how are we going to scale up? How are we going to get faster and more implementation of the most effective and cost-effective BMPs and continuous living cover? Again, as Catherine said, we know really what a lot of the solutions are. We're not looking for some brand new magic silver bullet, but we're always open to that. But it's really like, okay, we know what we've been needing for a while now. How do we get that scaled up faster and more? Wastewater is a relatively small portion of the problem, especially when it comes to nitrogen. And with phosphorus, we've had huge gains in making improvements in phosphorus reduction. But we have a brand new wastewater nitrogen reduction strategy that just was issued within the last couple of weeks here, but that will get incorporated into the overall state strategy. And then really kind of looking at the goals, we have made some progress. So again, especially on phosphorus, in some areas on nitrogen. There's other places things are backsliding with nitrates. Looking at what are the appropriate goals moving forward and how do we get there, as well as dovetailing this all with local efforts. I mentioned the wastewater nutrient reduction strategy. So that was again just issued here in April. Requiring new nitrogen management plans for wastewater treatment plants, looking at what the needs are for nitrogen limits in wastewater permits. And there will be the initiation of a rulemaking related to this as well. So to put that on a timeline, the nutrient reduction strategy is that this timeline begins at the beginning of this calendar year. It's been an ongoing effort, wrapping it up by late next year. Feedlot permit issuance and development right now, again, hoping to get that on public notice this summer, and if we can get it wrapped up and begin implementing it by the end of the year. Feedlot rule revision beginning later this year, and of course, rulemaking will go on for a while. It's not a quick process. And the wastewater nitrogen reduction implementation has been ongoing in terms of having monitoring done at wastewater facilities for years now. And now the strategy that was just released, implementing those provisions that I talked about moving forward. And then just as a conceptual side, just to think about how there's a lot of efforts underway, right? And so it is this combination of efforts that aren't really as siloed sometimes as we think of them in our heads. There are multiple benefits of a lot of things we do, right? So there's agricultural waste management practices that have been going on since the Dust Bowl days, and we continue to get better at those and refine those. But again, wanting to promote them more and more. You know, the 1 million acres that the agricultural water certification program reached is fantastic, but we need many more millions of acres of that. We need better soil health. We need more living cover, whether that's old school crops like oats and alfalfa, or if it's new school crops like Kernza, cover crops. We need that. We need water storage where we can store water. We can't really store water in the karst very well, but we can store it in other parts of the state, and that has huge benefits. So agricultural BMPs, the nutrient reduction strategy that looks not just at agriculture is a big part, but more holistically at all of our nutrient sources. And then as we talk about climate change and everything we're doing there for climate resiliency, a lot of the practices that are being called for there to, for example, prevent flooding, a lot of those have benefits for reducing nutrient reduction as well. So just kind of holistically thinking about how we're bringing all these efforts together. I think that's it.
Great. Well, I believe that Chair Daubenberger has had to leave us to get to the legislature. So I am going to pick up and chair the rest of the meeting. And I just want to say thanks to Catherine, Tanny, Margaret, and Glenn for that presentation. There was a lot there, but clearly a very important informational item for the board. So I do want to take a few minutes if anyone from the board has questions for our presenters and regarding the information they shared with us. You can either raise your hand or jump in or turn your name card sideways if you're in the room. Member Nelson.
I have, Madam Chair, I have lots of questions, but I don't want to dominate. So stop me if I'm going too long, but.
And can I just, sorry, I'm going to stop you before you even start. I apologize for that, Member Nelson, but one thing maybe I would just pose to the board, because it does seem like this is a really important topic and there's a lot of information here. And we can certainly initiate some discussion today, but also recognizing we are getting closer to the close of our meeting. I guess maybe I just ask if board members are interested in at a future meeting, reserving some specific time for discussion on this presentation, and maybe if we could beg more time from the presenters, that would allow folks to ask some initial questions today, but also give folks some time to kind of think about what we heard and then come back and have some discussion. Director Nuschler, if that seems reasonable to you. I'm seeing nodding heads at least around the table. So.
And perhaps Chair, after session when we know what might have gotten funded and what didn't get
Yeah.
funded and where that leaves us.
Okay, perfect. So we will plan on that. So Member Nelson, now go ahead and ask away, but with the comfort of knowing this is not our last opportunity for the board to discuss this topic.
And I'll take some of my questions offline with staff that are more technical. But I'm wondering from the health perspective that it was a number of years ago that I think it started in Ohio and then we took it up, that within the aquatic life standards, there was the recognition that numeric water quality standards were sort of surrogate standards. That you had a standard for phosphorus or some toxicity that affected the aquatic life organisms, bugs in the streams, but we really didn't have measures of what the outcome was that we were trying to do, which was protect the organisms in the streams. So he went through a huge effort to change that, and we now have indices of biological integrity and so forth. And I'm wondering here if it's ever been thought about, you know, we have a standard of 10 for nitrates, but have we looked at also complementing that with some measure of the incidences of blue baby syndrome or some of these things that are the ultimate outcome of what we're trying to look at? I'm not saying eliminate the standard, but also have a complementary standard that's the actual outcome.
Amy, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I'll be glad to take that. We often get asked, well, how many cases of blue baby syndrome are in the state? And in the world of public health, we have something called reportable diseases. So where there's a pathology diagnosis of cancer, it has to be reported to the department. Legionellosis has to be reported to the department. But blue baby syndrome or methemoglobinemia does not have to be reported to the department. The way that we learned about it back in the 1940s was because there was an outbreak, if you will, of cases in southwestern Minnesota, about 145 over a 2-year period. And so there was alarm among the medical community out there, and they contacted the state health department. It was quickly traced back to these higher levels of nitrate in the drinking water wells. They knew exactly what the levels were. And the medical community and then parents responded very quickly. And so they stopped using those high nitrate wells as a source of water it was before the days of formula, so they were diluting cow's milk and using other milk substitutes. In the following years, there was only 12 cases of blue baby syndrome. And so we know that the community responded very effectively, and we've continued to put out a lot of materials around blue baby syndrome and the concerns, and it's a part of outreach to parents. So we don't hear about blue baby cases, so it would not be a very effective measure for health outcomes. As I mentioned earlier, there have been a growing number of epidemiological studies pointing to some associations between nitrate in drinking water and certain health outcomes. However, in those studies, a great miss is exactly what was the level of nitrate in the drinking water for those health outcomes. And so we're watching that carefully. And that's why, to this point, we're taking the position that the value of 10 is an effective value for protecting the health of all Minnesotans, not just infants and pregnant people, but protective, as far as we know, against these other potential health outcomes.
Thank you. I'll just do one more question.
Perfect.
Margaret, you talked about the communities, level 1s and level 2s. I'm assuming some of those communities would have multiple wells. So is the trigger the blended water, or is it any individual well might trigger those levels?
Thanks for that question. So that standard is based on raw water. And so even if they have blended it and serve it, which is required under the Safe Drinking Water Act, serve it to customers at a level that's below that 10 parts per million. Our rule is based on raw water and it's based on individual wells. So one well is above that standard, then the community comes in under the rule. There are instances where maybe multiple wells are impacted in that as well.
That would be more protective. Yeah, thank you.
Other board members have questions? You want to ask a third one, member Nelson?
Okay, Glenn, so
Make it
wastewater,
fair to Glenn.
yeah, wastewater nitrogen, are you gonna go to a total nitrogen limit so you don't have ammonia versus nitrate anymore and nitrification? Is that where you're headed?
So this is Katrina, a couple things come to mind. First, you mentioned the indices of biologic integrity and how we protect aquatic life and how some standards will act as surrogate for others. And I will say that an aquatic life nitrate standard is on our docket of our triennial review water quality standards. We also have to come up with PFAS drinking water standards and other standards. So it's, it takes time to get through that. We also recognize that we need to be making reductions in wastewater now. And part of the benefit of this watershed approach and the data that has been collected from small streams, larger streams, all the way to the Mississippi River means that when we are developing watershed restoration and protection strategies, we are looking at the health of these critters and saying, are there stressors that exist that we know? And in a number of places, we can point to nitrate as one of those stressors. And so, and people here know this, but one of the tools under the Clean Water Act is even when you don't have a numeric water quality standard to protect for aquatic life, you can do a numeric translation of a narrative standard that says, like, we need to have a healthy aquatic life community and it needs to be diverse. And that's why we have the IBI. And so we can make those inferences and look at what is necessary in those cases. And when we know that there are point sources, which also would be called out in those RAPs, the restoration and protection strategies, we can move ahead with limiting nitrogen and require nitrogen reductions from wastewater treatment plants in advance of promulgation of an official aquatic life. That's not a lot of places in the state, because Glenn can speak to this, but we know that 90+% of nitrate comes from row crop agriculture, most of it. But during certain times of the year, wastewater may be a larger load. We are also limiting ammonia. So if I am a wastewater treatment operator or somebody at the municipal level who thinks about capital investments and planning, I certainly am thinking about all of the limits that may be coming my way when I'm thinking about design and investment. And we've seen in Minnesota that 10, 15 years ago, people would say, oh, biological phosphorus is work here because it's too cold. Well, we know that's not true. So we know that we don't have biological nutrient removal happening widely, meaning both phosphorus and nitrogen in Minnesota, but we've seen it happen in other parts of the country. And I would expect that as we move through this process of looking at what's required in RAPs and where we're moving with the nitrate water quality standard, as well as ammonia, that we're going to see more of those types of facilities being. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Oh, that's great.
Member Bento.
Thank you, Commissioner, Chair. I'll be going from this to a meeting at the Met Council where there will also be a conversation about water quality and water health. And having grown up in southeastern Minnesota, I found this presentation today particularly informative. I was recently at a meeting of the elected officers from the townships in Dakota County, and they were given a presentation about the high levels of manganese, PFAS, and other nitrates in their wells. And I'm curious as to, and this can happen at a future meeting, this doesn't have to be discussed today, but I'm curious as to how you would just keep an eye on all of this statewide. We're not a little state. And there's just so much going on. Right now, of course, southeastern Minnesota is the highlight. From just a practical standpoint, how do you help the whole state?
I think we always are operating at multiple levels, right? So statewide efforts like the state water plant, the state nutrient reduction strategy, those types of things. But then we also, for better than a decade now, the state has said we are going to use this watershed approach, which divides us up into 80 watersheds right across the state, and it's still a large scale, but it's a lot smaller than the state. So the watershed restoration protection strategies, of which we developed the last one of those for the 80 watersheds last June, have laid a scientific foundation so that we can work with the local soil water conservation districts, watershed districts, to really inform their local water planning so that they can key in on the biggest issues and key in on portions of the landscape where the biggest problems are. And then watershed-based implementation funding and other kind of defining the common through border water resources is and implementing those plans and moving things forward. So we're operating at that more local scale of the watersheds as well as and there's a iterative back and forth that goes on between those. They inform each other, improve each other as we go. But this, again, the scale of adoption that we need to address a lot of these issues is massive. It's been decades of going in the direction that's gotten us to where we are now. Problems that we have. And it will take decades to move us forward. But it's possible and it happens. Phosphorus is a great success story in the state. When you look at the show graphs of the levels of phosphorus coming out of wastewater treatment plants over the last 20 years, and it has crashed. That's fantastic. That's where we need to get to with nitrogen. And that's what Trina was just speaking of right now. So yeah, we need to figure out, again, how do we scale up? We know we need continuous living cover in many more acres than we currently have. Cover crops or perennial crops, all those types of things. So yes, we are a big state. I sometimes wonder, what would it be like to be in like Vermont?
Rhode Island.
Much smaller. Yeah, because we're a huge state geographically and just, yeah, I mean, we have literally, right, prickly pear cactus grows native in southwest Minnesota, and then you have the Norwegian Riviera, the North Shore, and everything in between, you know, and so it's kind of.
Norwegian Riviera.
And so maybe I will just add to that. So I think, Glenn, great acknowledgement of just that interagency effort through one watershed, one plan, and really thinking about the sub-watershed scale and the way that we organize that. So all the agencies here presenting have reps on those teams and really contribute to that process. And then more specifically around groundwater and how we think about that. For vulnerable groundwater, that really starts with geology and soils. So what we know is that not everywhere is nitrate in groundwater a problem. And so there are areas of the state with confining layers that really just protect that aquifer and make sure that there is very slow or no downward movement of nitrate. And so in the case of groundwater, I think we've done a good job of starting to delineate those. About 15% of the state is where we really have those vulnerable conditions of either a shallow depth to bedrock, where you just have a thin layer over that bedrock. You have karst topography like we see in the southeast, or you have textured soil. So mapping that allows us to think about and start to target those efforts. So the same type of support that we have is not the same in each county. In some counties, we have partnerships, we have ongoing efforts. Then others are working on more maybe surface water issues. So groundwater allows us to distinguish that a little bit more maybe than surface water and challenges maybe at scale of some of those issues.
I could just follow up. I think it would be good for us when we do the follow-up conversation to talk a little bit about communication and education. So I think one of the things that we're suffering from, and this is, society as a whole, but certainly in Minnesota, is the decline in readership with our newspapers and the loss of community newspapers in greater Minnesota. My hometown newspaper, the Chatfield News, was something that we subscribed to into our old ages. Well, it no longer exists. And the replacement isn't as entertaining. So, or informative, but I just think we need to keep that in mind because if folks are functioning based on the telephone tree type approach to learning about these complex issues, it just makes it that much more challenging for everybody.
Well, I thank you, board members, for those comments, and we will look forward to more discussion on this topic. And thanks again to our presenters. And I think just to close out this topic, Director Nuschler is gonna just give us a little bit of a sense of what is next for the state water plan in the next 5 years.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And it actually follows very directly from what Councilmember Vento was saying. So a reminder that the state water plan happens on 10-year intervals. So it was done in 2020, but in the interim, in the 5-year periods, EQB is charged with, putting together some assessments. And in general, what that has been in the past is there's been several different groundwater reports from PCA, from AG, from the different agencies about the monitoring and the information that they have. And then it's kind of summed together. It was called the Water Policy Report in 2015. And so I've already talked a little bit to my colleagues about working with them over starting kind of this summer to start to figure out like what do we want to put in the next report. And I think, Councilmember Vento, your thoughts about what can we do to really make it an informative and interesting place that really pulls together a bunch of information and maybe not, to the level of the geologic atlases that I know everybody loves, but in a level that that speaks in a communicative way to the big picture of what are our water challenges, what is our water data, what is our water information. I don't know, that's me just brainstorming some things, but we will have some opportunities over the next year as we work towards putting that out in September of 2025 to talk about what that is and how do we give the best picture of information and support meaningful conversations out to the state agencies and the public.
Thank you for that, Director Nuschler, and we will pick that thread and any others that folks want to pull on related to this topic of nitrates when we have our next conversation. And with that, I do want to move to our final item of public comment, and I don't want to miss the opportunity for folks who may be in the room with us or online who have a comment for the EQB. I will just note that we are going to prioritize comments on the nitrate issue, but we'll be also happy to take comments on other items. If you are in person, you want to make sure that you have signed up on the in-person sheet. If you are with us online in Teams, please raise your hand if you would like to comment. And I think we will ask Priscilla to call on folks.
Here. I don't think we have anyone signed up in person, but I'll just take a moment and see if there's anyone who wants to write a public comment.
We've got a hand here.
Should I just stand? Wait, or do you want to come up to the table here where our presenters were, and then the camera will see you nicely?
All right, well, thank you, Chair and members. I am grateful for the presentations, and I had a question that had to do with vulnerable groundwater as a condition of geology and soils. And
Sorry, could you just introduce yourself for the record too? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Carly Griffith. I'm the Water Program Director at the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. And to the point that Margaret made earlier about vulnerable groundwater as a condition of geology and soils, I know that there is a definition of vulnerable groundwater areas under the groundwater protection rule that includes 3 factors: coarse textured soils, shallow depths of bedrock, and karst bedrock. And I noticed that the vulnerable field restrictions for the proposed CAFO permit revisions are focused on shallow depth to bedrock and coarse textured soils. So I wondered if you could speak any more to the absence of karst bedrock as one of those geologic conditions of vulnerability.
We are looking to align our vulnerable acres map with Department of Agriculture's map, so there's not going to be a issue about that. Obviously, karst geology is highly multiple as well. So I can't really say much more beyond that at this point with it being proposed and such, but again, we'll be going to public comment on the rule this summer.
No, I think we'll. Thank you.
I don't see anyone else online, Chair, so I think that might be all.
Great, thanks, Priscilla. Well, we'll thank the one commenter and that we had today. And again, I want to thank EQB staff and all the staff from the agencies who presented today. It was a really informative meeting. And with that, we have reached the end of the agenda. And so I would ask for a motion to adjourn. Commissioner Peterson's already get to it. Okay, motion made by Commissioner Peterson, seconded by Commissioner Arnold. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? I hear some more ayes, no nays. Motion carries and the meeting is adjourned.
Right.